Kyoto was designed to be eternal. The emperors who built it in 794 laid it out on a perfect grid, modelled on the Tang Chinese capital of Chang'an, with the Imperial Palace at the north, the avenues running south like spokes from a wheel of absolute power. It was called Heiankyo, the capital of peace and tranquility, and for roughly 400 years it worked. No invasions, no sieges, no burning. The city grew and refined itself into something so cultivated, so layered with poetry and ritual and aesthetics, that its court nobility developed an entire philosophy around the beauty of things passing away. They called it mono no aware, the bittersweet ache of impermanence. They wrote poems about it, they painted it, they built gardens to embody it. Then, in 1467, a war broke out in the streets of Kyoto that burned half the city to ash and shattered the world those poems had described. The people who had made an art form of impermanence discovered that they had been right all along. A city laid out like a prayer. Broad avenues run perfectly north to south, east to west. The streets so straight that on a clear morning you can see the mountains from the city's heart. The mountains are always there, green in summer, white in winter, close enough to feel like walls. The Kamo River runs along the eastern edge, cold and clear, and in the early morning its banks are empty except for herons. The city smells of cedar and charcoal smoke and something faintly sweet, plum blossom perhaps, or the incense drifting from a temple courtyard. Wooden gates mark the entrances to noble compounds. Behind high walls, raked gravel and shaped pines hold the silence. A woman in layered silk robes moves through a covered corridor, her sleeve trailing. A bell rings, somewhere distant and unhurried. The city is awake, but it does not rush. The year is 794. Emperor Kanmu makes a decision that will shape Japanese civilization for the next 7 centuries. He moves the imperial capital from Nagaoka, a city barely a decade old, cursed by rumor and bad omens, to a wide valley between 2 rivers, ringed on 3 sides by forested mountains. The new city will be called Heiankyo. It is drawn on paper before the first post is driven into the ground. The plan is a direct homage to Chang'an, the Tang dynasty capital that Japanese envoys had studied with careful admiration for generations. A central avenue, Suzaku-oji, runs nearly 80 meters wide from the Great Southern Gate to the Imperial compound at the north. The city is divided into eastern and western halves. Markets are assigned fixed locations. Temples are placed at the edges, not the center. The Buddhists, however politically influential, are kept deliberately outside the sacred administrative core. Archaeology confirms that the city was never quite as symmetrical as the planners intended. The western half, Ukyo, proved swampy and difficult to drain. Within a century it had largely been abandoned, and the city's living weight shifted east, toward the Kamo River. The streets of modern Kyoto still follow the Heian grid in the areas that thrived. A ghost map you can walk today. Emperor Kanmu himself is not a distant abstraction. The Chronicles describe him as a man of considerable energy. He held court, issued edicts, managed the vast machinery of Chinese-style bureaucracy, but also as someone visibly anxious about the spiritual health of his new city. He ordered purification rituals. He consulted diviners. He was, in other words, a man who had bet his dynasty on a new beginning and was not entirely certain the gods approved. The avenues were wide and the intentions were perfect. The city set to work becoming real. By the mid-9th century, something unprecedented is happening inside the walls of Heiankyo. The Japanese court has absorbed the Chinese model so thoroughly that it is now, quietly, beginning to discard it, not in rebellion, but in refinement. Contact with Tang China ends formally in 894, and the court turns inward. What emerges from that turning is one of the most distinctive literary and aesthetic cultures in human history. The nobility lived in a world of exquisite constraint. The Shinden Zukuri mansion, a complex of connected wooden pavilions around a central garden with a pond, was the physical grammar of aristocratic life. Rooms were defined not by walls but by screens and curtains. Light filtered through paper, sound carried through wood. Everything was visible, and nothing was quite seen. It was in one of these pavilions that Murasaki Shikibu wrote the tale of Genji, a portrait of the court from inside its own silks, the politics conducted through poetry, the love affairs measured by the quality of a perfumed letter, the casual cruelty of a society that valued elegance above almost everything else. Copies of its pages were being read within decades of its composition. They have never stopped, and the physical world it described was not invented. Excavations in Kyoto's Zukyo district have uncovered the remains of aristocratic mansions consistent with her descriptions. Post-hole patterns of pavilion complexes, fragments of polychrome tiles, the channels of ornamental garden ponds, still traceable in the earth. The novel and the archaeology confirm each other. The court had built itself a mirror. It could not stop looking into it. Walk through Heiankyo in the late 10th century, and you move through layers of sound. In the noble quarters, the city is hushed, the deliberate quiet of people for whom noise is a form of vulgarity. But move south or east toward the river, and the register changes. Carpenters work on a temple expansion. Porters carry rice bales from the market. A blacksmith's hammer rings steadily somewhere behind a wall. The smell shifts from incense and cedar to fish paste, boiling grain, the sharp edge of a charcoal brazier. Children chase a dog between stalls. A monk argues price with a grain merchant. The city below the aristocracy is loud and practical, and largely invisible to the literature that has made it famous. The year is 939. Far from the capital, a warrior named Taira no Masakado has declared himself the new emperor of the East, and seized control of 8 provinces in a single season. He faced significant opposition and was eventually subdued. Yet his rebellion announced something the Heian court would spend 2 centuries trying not to acknowledge. Power, real power, was shifting to men who carried swords. The warrior clans, the Taira and the Minamoto above all others, were not outsiders. They were provincial nobility, descended from imperial bloodlines, technically servants of the court, but they governed the countryside that fed the capital. They commanded the armies the court needed but could not raise itself, and they were growing in confidence. A samurai named Minamoto no Yorioshi, campaigning in the northern provinces in the 1050s, left a record of his campaigns that reads with startling directness. Lists of battles, counts of enemies killed, notes on supply lines and weather. Against the poetry of the court, it sounds like a door being kicked open. His world and Murasaki's were the same city. They might as well have been different planets. The physical evidence of this tension is visible in Kyoto's temple architecture of the late Heian period. Fortified walls, defensive earthworks, the gradual hardening of what had been purely ceremonial structures. The city was arming itself slowly, without quite admitting it. Below the poetry, the swords were being sharpened. The year is 1177. A major fire erupts in the eastern part of the city, most likely from a residence exacerbated by wind, and causes extensive destruction, consuming a third of Heiankyo. The fire is an accident. What follows is not. The Taira clan, under the brilliant and ruthless Taira no Kiyomori, had by this point effectively seized control of the imperial court. Kiyomori was the first warrior to hold the office of Grand Chancellor. He arranged marriages, controlled succession, and treated the emperor with the elaborate courtesy of a man who no longer needed to take him seriously. The old aristocracy despised him. The Minamoto clan was preparing its response. What followed between 1180 and 1185 was the Genpei War, 5 years of battles across the length of Japan that ended the Heian order forever. The decisive Battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, fought at sea in the straits between Honshu and Kyushu, saw the Taira's complete defeat and the end of Emperor Antoku's reign. His grandmother, in a final act of devotion, chose a solemn fate rather than surrender, silence. Then the sea closed over them. The victorious Minamoto leader, Yoritomo, made a decision that defined Japanese history for the next 7 centuries. He did not move to Kyoto. He established his military government, his shogunate, in Kamakura, far to the east. The emperor would remain in Kyoto. The poetry would remain, but the power was elsewhere now, and everyone knew it. The Kyoto that survived the Genpei War was physically scarred and politically hollowed. The aristocratic mansions had been damaged in the fighting. Several of the great temple complexes had burned. The broad avenues had narrowed due to encroachments and market stalls. The slow compression of a city adjusting to a changed world. You can see the archaeological trace of this compression in the layers below the modern city. The Heian period lots, large and regular, replaced by smaller, denser medieval plots in the strata above. The emperor still held his court. The court still wrote its poems. But the world the poems described was already a memory. Kyoto in the early 13th century smells different than it did 200 years before. The old aristocracy is still there, impoverished in many cases, but present, maintaining their rituals with the determination of people who understand that form, once abandoned, cannot be recovered. But the city has opened. Merchants from the port of Hakata bring Chinese ceramics and copper coins. Markets have proliferated beyond their assigned zones. A new kind of Buddhism, Zen, brought back from China by monks who had actually traveled there, is taking root in the hills around the city. Its temples are spare and purposeful in a way that the older, more elaborate Buddhist complexes are not. Its gardens use rock and raked gravel to suggest water, forest, mountains. They are meditations made physical. Several of them still exist, unchanged in their fundamental design, in the hills of eastern Kyoto today. The monk Eisai, who introduced Zen formally to Japan in the late 12th century, also brought back tea, not as a curiosity, as a practice, a ritual of attention and stillness that would eventually become one of the most recognizable cultural exports Japan has ever produced. He is buried in Kyoto. His influence is present in every tea house that has ever been built in the city since. By 1221, the court attempted to reassert itself. The Jokyu War, in which the retired Emperor Go-Toba rallied support against the Kamakura shogunate. He lost within months. He was exiled to the Oki Islands where he died. It was the last serious attempt by the Imperial institution to reclaim military power for over a century. The emperor composed poetry in exile. The shogun built roads. The year is 1336. A warrior named Ashikaga Takauji has overthrown the Kamakura shogunate, briefly restored imperial power, and then, when the emperor proved unwilling to leave things as they were, established his own shogunate in Kyoto. The warriors, after a century and a half away, had come home. The Ashikaga shoguns built their headquarters in the Murasaki district of Kyoto, and the period of their rule takes its name from that street. They were, in their way, the strangest rulers in Japanese history. Military men who became obsessive patrons of the arts. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun, completed the Kinkaku-ji, the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, in 1397. Its top 2 floors are covered in gold leaf. It sits on the edge of a pond, designed so that its reflection appears in the water, doubling the gold. It was built as a retirement villa. It was also a statement. We are the power now, and we are not embarrassed by that. Yoshimitsu patronized no theater. The spare, masked dramatic form developed by Zeami Motokiyo, who performed for the shogun and wrote his aesthetic treatises under his protection. No plays are still performed today using texts Zeami wrote in Yoshimitsu's Kyoto. Connection from the 14th century stage to the modern performance is unbroken. A merchant named Zenya Tokuro, documented in guild records from the mid-15th century, operated a fabric business in the Nishijin district. the weaving quarter of Kyoto that had existed since the Heian period. His ledgers, preserved in a temple archive, show trade with merchants from Sakai, the great port city to the south, and references to patterns commissioned by both temple officials and samurai households. He was not famous. He kept his accounts carefully. The Nishijin weaving district still exists. Its looms still run. The warriors had become courtiers. Courtiers had become memories. Only the weavers kept working. The year is 1467. A succession dispute within the Ashikaga Shogunate, which of two candidates should inherit the title, has pulled every major military lord in Japan into one of two camps. The armies are enormous, and they are all somehow in Kyoto. What followed lasted 11 years and is remembered in Japanese history as the Onin War. Though war suggests a clarity of objectives and outcomes that the conflict entirely lacked. It was closer to a prolonged, catastrophic struggle conducted through urban destruction. The Eastern Army held the Kanmu riverbank. The Western Army held the older city. Between them, Kyoto suffered devastation on an almost incomprehensible scale. Neighborhood by neighborhood, temple by temple. The aristocratic mansions that had stood since the Heian period. The great market streets, the guild quarters. The Nishijin weaving district, Zenya Takuro's world, was almost entirely consumed. The Imperial Palace endured repeated fire damage and occupation, a landscape of ash and silence, then rain, then the slow return of sound. The chronicles of the period are not distant and analytical. They are written by people living inside the catastrophe, and they carry a tone of raw, unmediated shock, not because violence was new to Japan, but because this violence was here, in the city that had been the center of everything for 700 years. A court lady named Nakanoin Michiko recorded in her diary that she could not see the mountains from her house because of the smoke. She had lived in Kyoto her entire life. She had always been able to see the mountains. The archaeological evidence of the Onin War is visible in the stratigraphy of excavations across central Kyoto. A distinct burn layer, consistent in depth and date across multiple sites, sitting in the record like a black line drawn across 7 centuries of accumulated civilization. By 1477, when the fighting finally exhausted itself, not resolved, simply depleted, Kyoto's population had seen a drastic decline. The Ashikaga shogun still nominally ruled from whatever remained of his headquarters. The emperor still held his diminished court. But the city that had been the most refined urban space in the world had been reduced, in a decade, to a landscape of ruins and temporary shelters, and people trying to remember what had been where. The people who had made an art of impermanence had run out of metaphors. If Kyoto's story stayed with you, there is more waiting. Every city in this series carries the same question underneath its history. How much can a place absorb before it becomes something else entirely? Baghdad asked it. Samarkand asked it. Next, we follow a city that answered differently from all of them. If you want to be there when that story begins, the subscribe button is below. No obligation, just history. Told the way it deserves to be told. And if something in this video surprised you, leave it in the comments. The best conversations on this channel happen there.